last beacon. Chapter 1. The desert world of Arrakis was a place of unparalleled harshness, where only the strongest and most cunning could hope to survive. It was on this unforgiving planet that Paul Atreides, scion of a noble house, found himself thrust into a destiny he could never have imagined. Leto walked the sands, his still suit capturing every precious drop of moisture exhaled from his lungs. The blue and blue eyes marking him as one changed by the spice stared keenly across the barren landscape. Fremen, the desert people, had spoken of a prophecy, a man who would lead them to freedom and glory. He knew he must walk a razor's edge to fulfill this role, while a greater goal drove him forward still, revenge against those who had massacred his family and people. Peter de Vries, Twisted Mentat, had not foreseen this eventuality in all his cynical plotting. The Padisha Emperor's own daughter had fallen for the young Duke, and now aided his cause from within the heart of the Imperium. Leto knew he must use this to his advantage, even as the thought of it tore at his noble sensibilities. Only by harnessing the desert power of the Fremen and the secrets locked within his blood could Leto hope to defeat the depraved Baron Harkonnen and his Sardaukar minions. The path forward was uncertain, but the newly forged Duke Paul Atreides would stop at nothing to avenge his father and deliver his people to their promised glory. And in the deep desert waited Shai-Hulud, the great sandworms of Arrakis. In their titanic forms was power unimaginable, and a future that would shake the Imperium to its foundations. The spice must flow. Chapter 2. The Sietch was alive with a palpable energy and sense of purpose as Paul arrived with his mother, the Lady Jessica. The Naib Stilgar came forth from the throng of blue-eyed freemen to clasp the young Duke's hand in a firm grip. "Usul, we have placed our faith in you," Stilgar said, his voice resonating with solemn authority. "The freemen do not give their loyalty easily. You must prove yourself worthy to lead us against the Harkonnen." Paul met the Naib's gaze unflinchingly. The mystical visions that came to him as a result of his mother's Bene Gesserit training in the ways of the sisterhood had shown him glimpses of the path ahead. It would be a road paved with sacrifice and hardship, but one that led to an outcome that would reshape the Imperium forever. "I will not fail you still," Paul replied, using the shortened form of the Naib's name that only trusted friends and advisors employed. "My father's signet ring is an emblem of my pledge. House Atreides has always been a friend to the Fremen. That will not change under my rule." "See that it does not," Stilgar said sternly. "We have cast our lot with you, but the desert does not forgive weakness or hesitation." As Paul moved through the Sietch, taking in the Spartan living conditions of the Fremen, he silently swore to himself that he would not rest until his father's murderers had paid the ultimate price. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen thought himself untouchable, but he would soon learn the true depths of Atreides' resolve. And then there was the matter of the spice melange, the most precious substance in the known universe. It was the linchpin around which the fate of billions hinged, and Arrakis was its only known source. Whoever controlled the spice controlled the Imperium itself. As Paul lay down to sleep on a hard Fremen pallet that night, his mind raced with the implications of the task before him. The desert power was his to command, but wielding it effectively would require a delicate touch and an unyielding will. For the sake of his fallen father, his subjugated people, and the future of all humanity, Paul Atreides would rise to meet this challenge. The sleeper must awaken. Chapter 3. The days turned into weeks as Paul adapted to the unforgiving rigors of life among the Fremen. The Naib Stilgar himself oversaw much of the young Duke's training, ensuring he learned the ways of the desert and the secret methods of water discipline that allowed the Fremen to survive in such a harsh environment. During this time, Paul's prescient visions began to intensify and clarify. He saw glimpses of a future where he led the Fremen on a holy war across the stars, uniting humanity under his banner and reshaping the very fabric of the Imperium. But always there was a shadowy figure at the edge of these dreams, a blind spot that even his considerable powers could not penetrate. As Paul's reputation grew among the Fremen, whispers began to circulate that he might be the long-prophesied Mahdi, the one who would lead them to paradise. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood's own messianic plot, the Missionaria Protectiva, was taking hold among the Fremen, and Paul found himself at the center of a swelling tide of faith and fervor. Meanwhile, on distant Giedi Prime, the Baron Harkonnen schemed and plotted, determined to crush the budding Fremen insurgency and secure Arrakis for himself. The Emperor's support was assured for now, but the Baron knew that his grip on power was only as strong as his control of the spice. And then there was the question of the mysterious Tleilaxu and their genetically engineered mentats, who seemed to have their own inscrutable agenda. The face dancer Seatail had approached Paul with cryptic offers of alliance, but the young Duke was wary of entangling himself with such a shadowy faction. As Paul stood atop a towering dune, gazing out over the endless expanse of the desert, he knew that the time for hiding and preparation was coming to an end. The Harkonnen would not rest until they had exterminated House Atreides and ground the Fremen under their heel. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but Paul had no choice but to embrace his destiny. The future of the universe itself hung in the balance. Chapter 4. The great hall of the Emperor's palace on Kaitain was a riot of color and sound as the assembled nobles of the Landsraad engaged in their endless intrigues and maneuverings. But beneath the veneer of gaiety and celebration lay a palpable tension, a sense that momentous events were unfolding on the fringes of the Imperium. Princess Irulan, the Emperor's eldest daughter and a trained Bene Gesserit, watched the proceedings with a keen eye, searching for any sign of her father's intentions. She knew that the delicate balance of power that had held the Imperium together for generations was beginning to unravel, and House Corrino's grip on the throne was not as secure as it once had been. Irulan's thoughts turned to the young Duke Atreides, the man she had been trained to seduce and manipulate as part of the Sisterhood's breeding program. But something about Paul had touched her in a way she had not anticipated, awakening feelings she had long thought suppressed. His cause, the struggle of his people against the brutal Harkonnen, had ignited a spark of rebellion in her own heart. As the Emperor made his grand entrance, resplendent in his royal regalia, Irulan steeled herself for what was to come. She knew her father's advisors were pushing for a more aggressive stance against the growing Fremen insurgency on Arrakis, and that the Spacing Guild's monopoly on interstellar travel gave them a powerful voice in imperial policy. But Irulan had her own network of spies and informants, and she had learned of a secret communication from the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam to her father. The details were unclear, but it seemed the Sisterhood believed that the young Paul Atreides was more than just a pawn in their breeding program. He was the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could bridge space and time, the ultimate goal of their centuries-long genetic experiment. As the Emperor began to speak, outlining his plans for a great military campaign to subdue Arrakis and secure the spice trade, Irulan made a silent vow to herself. She would do everything in her power to aid Paul and the Fremen, even if it meant defying her own father and the empire he represented. The future of the universe was at stake, and Irulan was determined to play her part in shaping it. Chapter 5. In the deep desert of Arrakis, where even the Fremen feared to tread, Paul Atreides stood alone, listening to the rush of sand and the distant thumping of a sandworm's approach. He had come to this place for solitude and contemplation, to grapple with the visions that haunted his every waking moment. As the worm drew closer, Paul reached out with his senses, feeling the rhythms of the desert and the creature that swam through its sands. The worm was a force of nature, a being of pure instinct and primal power. But Paul knew that even the greatest of predators could be tamed, given the right handler. With a deft movement, Paul mounted the sandworm, guiding it with subtle shifts of his body and a focused application of the voice, the Bene Gesserit tool for controlling others. The worm responded to his commands, carrying him swiftly across the dunes and into the heart of the deep desert. As they traveled, Paul's thoughts turned to the trials that lay ahead. The Harkonnen were massing their forces for an all-out assault on the Fremen Sietches, desperate to crush the growing rebellion before it could gain momentum. And the Emperor's own Sardaukar legions were being mobilized, their brutal efficiency and fanatical loyalty a terrifying prospect for any who dared oppose imperial rule. But Paul had an advantage that his enemies did not: the support of the Fremen people and the power of the desert itself. The Fremen's guerrilla tactics and intimate knowledge of the terrain would be a formidable match for even the most seasoned Sardaukar, and with Paul's prescient visions guiding their strategy, they had a chance to achieve the impossible. As the sandworm crested a towering dune, Paul gazed out over the vast expanse of the desert, feeling a sense of awe and wonder at the raw beauty of this unforgiving landscape. Here in the crucible of Arrakis, the fate of the universe would be decided, and Paul Atreides, the Muad'Dib, would be the one to shape that fate, for good or ill. Chapter 6. As the Fremen uprising gained momentum, the Spacing Guild found itself in a precarious position. The spice melange, the source of their power and the key to their monopoly on space travel, was becoming increasingly difficult to obtain as the conflict on Arrakis intensified. In the opulent chambers of the Guild's headquarters on Junction, the navigator Edric floated in his spice-filled tank, his mind racing with the possibilities and pitfalls of the unfolding situation. The Guild had long maintained a delicate balance, playing off the various factions of the Imperium against one another to ensure their own supremacy. But the rise of Paul Atreides and the Fremen threatened to upset that balance in ways even Edric's prescient abilities could not fully predict. The navigator's reverie was interrupted by the arrival of a Guild representative, a man whose name Edric had never bothered to learn. The representative bowed deeply, his movements betraying a hint of fear and reverence in the presence of the navigator. "Speak," Edric commanded, his voice echoing strangely in the confines of the tank. "Navigator, I bring news from Arrakis," the representative said, his voice trembling slightly. "The Fremen have struck again, this time against a major Harkonnen spice harvesting operation. The losses were substantial, and the flow of spice has been severely disrupted." Edric's mind raced with the implications of this news. The Guild's power rested on the spice, and any interruption in its supply could have catastrophic consequences for their ability to navigate the stars. And yet the navigator could not help but feel a grudging respect for the audacity of the Fremen and their young leader. "The Duke Atreides grows bold," Edric mused, more to himself than to the representative. "He plays a dangerous game, but one that could reap great rewards if he succeeds." The representative shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond. Edric paid him no mind, his thoughts already turning to the larger game at play. "We must tread carefully," the navigator said at last. "The Fremen are a force to be reckoned with, and we cannot afford to alienate them entirely. But neither can we allow them to disrupt the spice trade indefinitely. We must find a way to bring them into the fold, to make them see the value of cooperation with the Guild." The representative nodded, his relief palpable. "I will convey your message to the Guild Council, Navigator. We will do whatever is necessary to secure the flow of spice and maintain our position in the Imperium." Edric dismissed the representative with a wave of his hand, his mind already racing ahead to the next move in the great game. The Fremen and their Duke were a wild card, a variable that could tip the balance of power in unpredictable ways. But the Guild had not maintained its grip on the stars by shying away from challenges. They would find a way to bend the Fremen to their will, one way or another. Chapter 7. On the Harkonnen homeworld of Giedi Prime, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen seethed with rage and frustration. The reports from Arrakis were growing increasingly dire, with the Fremen insurgency gaining ground by the day. The Baron's own nephew, the brutish Glossu Raban, had proven himself woefully inadequate to the task of subduing the desert people and maintaining the flow of spice. In the depths of his palace, surrounded by the grotesque trappings of his wealth and power, the Baron paced back and forth, his mind churning with dark thoughts and twisted schemes. He had underestimated the young Duke Atreides, dismissing him as a callow youth unfit to lead. But now, with House Atreides effectively destroyed, and its heir leading a rebellion on Arrakis, the Baron was forced to confront the true depth of his miscalculation. A sudden commotion at the entrance to his chambers snapped the Baron out of his brooding. His mentat, Peter de Vries, burst into the room, his normally composed features twisted with a mixture of fear and excitement. "My Lord Baron," Peter gasped, dropping to one knee before the Baron's floating suspensor chair. "I bring news from Arrakis. The Fremen have struck again, this time against a heavily fortified Harkonnen garrison. The losses were significant." The Baron's eyes narrowed, his gaze boring into the Mentat's skull. "How significant?" he demanded, his voice a low, menacing growl. Peter swallowed hard, visibly steeling himself before responding. "The entire garrison was wiped out, my lord. Over 1,000 men killed or captured, and the spice harvesting equipment at the site was destroyed utterly." For a long moment the Baron was silent, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sudden violent motion, he lashed out, his meaty fist slamming into the arm of his suspensor chair with enough force to dent the metal. "Impossible!" the Baron roared, his face purpling with rage. "How could a rabble of desert savages overcome a fortified Harkonnen position? Rabban assured me that the garrison was impregnable." Peter, to his credit, did not flinch in the face of the Baron's fury. "It appears that the Fremen have grown bolder and more organized under the leadership of the Duke Atreides," he said carefully. "Their tactics have become more sophisticated, and they seem to have an uncanny ability to strike at our weakest points." The Baron's mind raced, considering the implications of this latest setback. He had always believed that the key to maintaining power was to crush one's enemies utterly, to grind them into the dirt and make them beg for mercy. But the Fremen, with their fanatical devotion to their cause and their intimate knowledge of the desert, were proving to be a more formidable foe than he had ever imagined. "We must redouble our efforts," the Baron said at last, his voice cold and hard as steel. "Rabban is clearly not up to the task of subduing these desert rats. I want you to take personal command of our forces on Arrakis, Peter. Crush the Fremen rebellion no matter the cost. We cannot allow this upstart duke to threaten our hold on the spice." Peter bowed his head, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "As you command, my Lord Baron. I will not fail you." As the Mentat took his leave, the Baron settled back in his suspensor chair, his mind already racing ahead to the battles to come. He would not underestimate the Duke Atreides again. This time he would crush him and his Fremen allies once and for all, and secure House Harkonnen's dominion over Arrakis and the spice trade forever. Chapter 8. In the heart of the deep desert, the Fremen Sietch of Tabor bustled with activity. The Fremen people, once scattered and divided, had begun to unite under the banner of Paul Atreides, the mysterious outlander who had proven himself a formidable leader and a powerful ally. At the center of the Sietch, Paul sat cross-legged on a woven rug, his eyes closed in meditation. Around him, Fremen warriors and watermasters went about their daily tasks, preparing for the battles to come. Some sharpened their krisk knives, the sacred blades that marked them as true Fremen. Others tended to the tribe's precious water stores, carefully rationing every drop. Among the Fremen, one figure stood out, Chani, the daughter of Liet Kynes, the planetologist who had been a friend and ally to House Atreides. Chani was a formidable warrior in her own right, with a fierce intelligence and an unwavering loyalty to her people. She had taken an interest in Paul from the moment he arrived in the Sietch, recognizing in him a kindred spirit and a potential leader for the Fremen cause. As Paul emerged from his meditation, Chani approached him, her blue within blue eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You have been in the desert for many days, Muad'Dib," she said softly, using the Fremen name they had given him. "What have you seen in your visions?" Paul met her gaze, his expression somber. "The future is uncertain," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of weariness. "I see many paths, many possible outcomes. But one thing is clear. The Fremen people are the key to the fate of Arrakis, and perhaps the entire universe." Chani nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We have always known that the desert holds great power," she said. "But we have been waiting for a leader who can harness that power, who can guide us to our destiny. Many believe that you are that leader, Muad'Dib." Paul was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I am not the Mahdi," he said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "I am not the savior that some believe me to be, but I do have a role to play in the events to come, and I will not shy away from that responsibility." Chani reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "The Fremen will follow you, Muad'Dib," she said. "We have seen your strength and your wisdom, and we know that you are the one who can lead us to victory against the Harkonnen and the Emperor." Paul squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of gratitude and affection for this fierce, loyal woman who had become his closest companion and confidant. Together we will face whatever challenges lie ahead, he said. The Fremen are strong, and we will not be broken by the machinations of our enemies. As the pair emerged from the sietch into the blinding sunlight of the desert, they were greeted by a sight that took their breath away. On the horizon, a vast army of Fremen warriors was assembling, their still suits glinting in the harsh light. At their head rode Stilgar, the Naib of Sietch Tabr, his face a mask of grim determination. "The time has come, Muad'Dib," Stilgar called out, his voice carrying across the sands. "The Harkonnen are massing their forces for an all-out assault on the sietches. We must strike back now before they can crush us." Paul nodded, his expression resolute. "Then let us ride," he said, mounting the sandworm that had been waiting patiently nearby. "Let us show the Harkonnen and the Emperor the true power of the desert and the strength of the Fremen people." With a thunderous roar, the Fremen army set off across the dunes, their hearts filled with a fierce determination to protect their homeland and their way of life. And at their head rode Paul Muad'Dib, the Duke of Arrakis, the leader who would guide them to their ultimate destiny. Chapter 9. As the Fremen army rode across the desert, Paul's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had come to Arrakis as an outcast, an exiled duke with nothing but his wits and his training to sustain him. But now he found himself at the head of a powerful force, a people who looked to him for guidance and leadership in the battles to come. It was a heavy responsibility, one that weighed on him like the crushing pressure of the deep desert. But Paul knew that he could not shrink from this challenge, not if he hoped to avenge his father's death and secure a future for his people. As they approached the site of the Harkonnen fortress, Paul called a halt to the march. He dismounted from his sandworm, feeling the beast's powerful muscles rippling beneath him as it came to a stop. Around him, the Fremen warriors did the same, their faces grim and determined beneath their still-suit masks. Paul surveyed the fortress with a critical eye, noting the thick walls and the heavy gun emplacements that bristled from its towers. The Harkonnen were well entrenched, and they would not give up their position easily. But Paul had an advantage that the Harkonnen did not: the power of the desert itself. He had spent long months learning the ways of the Fremen, mastering the art of riding the sandworms and harnessing the energy of the spice. Now, he would put those skills to the test. Turning to Stilgar, Paul outlined his plan. The Fremen would divide into 3 groups, each targeting a different section of the fortress. One group would scale the walls and take out the gun emplacements, while another would infiltrate the fortress through a network of underground tunnels that the Fremen used to move unseen through the desert. The third group, led by Paul himself, would mount a frontal assault, using the sandworms as living battering rams to breach the fortress walls. It was a daring plan, one that required perfect coordination and a willingness to sacrifice. But the Fremen were no strangers to sacrifice, and they knew that the stakes could not be higher. As the Fremen took their positions, Paul closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, feeling the pulse of the desert and the energy of the spice that flowed through his veins. He could sense the presence of the Harkonnen, their fear and their desperation as they prepared to defend their fortress. But Paul could also sense something else, a force that was greater than any one man or any one army. It was the force of destiny itself, the inexorable tide of history that swept all things before it. And in that moment, Paul knew that he was a part of that destiny, a key player in the great drama that was unfolding on Arrakis. He was the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could bridge space and time, the ultimate goal of the Bene Gesserit breeding program. But he was also something more, a leader, a warrior, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his people and fulfill his destiny. With a final silent prayer to the gods of the desert, Paul gave the signal to attack. And with a thunderous roar, the Fremen army surged forward, ready to meet their fate head-on. Chapter 10. The battle was joined in a clash of steel and a rush of sand, as the Fremen warriors hurled themselves against the walls of the Harkonnen fortress with reckless abandon. The Harkonnen defenders, caught off guard by the suddenness and ferocity of the attack, struggled to mount an effective defense. At the head of the charge, Paul rode his sandworm like a man possessed, his crysknife flashing in the harsh sunlight as he cut down Harkonnen soldiers left and right. Around him, the Fremen warriors fought with a savage fury, their still suits stained with the blood of their enemies. In the midst of the chaos, Paul caught sight of a familiar figure, Gurney Halleck, his old weapons master and loyal retainer. Gurney was locked in combat with a hulking Harkonnen sergeant, his balisette slung across his back as he wielded his sword with deadly precision. Paul urged his sandworm forward, coming to Gurney's aid just as the Harkonnen sergeant made a vicious swing at Gurney's head. Paul's crysknife flashed, and the sergeant fell back, clutching at his throat as blood gushed from the wound. "Gurney," Paul called out, his voice hoarse from the dust and the shouting. "I thought you were dead." Gurney grinned, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "Not yet, my lord," he said, clasping Paul's arm in a warrior's grip. "I escaped the Harkonnen's clutches and made my way to the Fremen. I knew that you would need my help to take back what is rightfully yours." Paul felt a surge of emotion at Gurney's words. He had thought his old friend lost forever, another casualty of the Harkonnen's treachery. But here he was, fighting by Paul's side once again, ready to lay down his life for House Atreides. Together, Paul and Gurney fought their way deeper into the fortress, the sandworm crushing Harkonnen soldiers beneath its massive bulk. The Fremen warriors, inspired by Paul's example, redoubled their efforts, driving the defenders back with a ferocity that was almost inhuman. And then suddenly, it was over. The last of the Harkonnen soldiers lay dead or dying, and the fortress was in Fremen hands. Paul stood atop the highest tower, surveying the carnage below, his heart heavy with the weight of the lives lost. But even in the midst of the destruction, Paul could feel a sense of hope and purpose that he had never known before. The Fremen had proven themselves to be a force to be reckoned with, a people who would not be cowed by the might of the Harkonnen or the Emperor. And Paul knew that this was only the beginning. The Fremen would need to unite like never before, to forge alliances with other houses and factions if they hoped to stand against the full might of the Imperium. But for now, in this moment of triumph, Paul allowed himself to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. He had taken the first step on the long road to his destiny, and he knew that he would not falter or turn back, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As the Fremen warriors raised their voices in a chant of victory, Paul closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, feeling the power and the potential that lay within him and his people. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Fremen, and their leader Paul Muad'Dib, would shape the destiny of Arrakis and the entire universe. Chapter 11. In the aftermath of the battle, Paul and his Fremen warriors regrouped in the heart of the conquered fortress. The Harkonnen dead were stripped of their water and equipment, their bodies left to the mercy of the desert. As Paul conferred with his advisors, a messenger arrived from the deep desert, bearing news of a gathering of Fremen leaders from across Arrakis. The time had come, the messenger said, for the Fremen to unite as never before, to forge a new future for their people and their planet. Paul knew that this was a crucial moment, a turning point in the struggle for Arrakis. The Fremen had proven their strength and their resolve, but they would need more than just military might to stand against the full power of the Imperium. With Gurney and Stilgar by his side, Paul set out across the desert, riding his sandworm to the place where the Fremen leaders had gathered. It was a journey fraught with danger, as the Harkonnen and the Emperor Sardaukar still roamed the sands, seeking to crush any resistance to their rule. But Paul and his companions were undaunted, their faith in their cause and their skills as warriors carrying them through. And when they arrived at the gathering place, they were greeted by a sight that took their breath away. Thousands of Fremen from sietches across the planet had come together in a great circle, their still suits and crysknives glinting in the harsh sun. At the center of the circle stood the Reverend Mother Ramallo, the spiritual leader of the Fremen people. As Paul approached, the Reverend Mother held up her hand in greeting. "Welcome, Muad'Dib," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her advanced age. "The Fremen have been waiting for you, for the one who will lead us to our destiny." Paul bowed his head in respect, feeling the weight of the moment upon him. "I am honored to be here, Reverend Mother," he said. "But I am not the Mahdi, the one who will bring paradise to Arrakis. I am only a man seeking to do what is right for my people." The Reverend Mother smiled, her eyes twinkling with a knowing light. "You are more than just a man, Paul Atreides," she said. "You are the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who can bridge space and time, and you are the one who will lead the Fremen to victory against those who would oppress us." With those words, the Reverend Mother stepped forward and placed her hand on Paul's forehead, closing her eyes in concentration. Paul felt a surge of energy coursing through him, a power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. And then, in a flash of insight, he saw the future unfolding before him. He saw the Fremen rising up as one, casting off the shackles of oppression and forging a new destiny for themselves and their planet. He saw the Imperium crumbling, the old order giving way to a new age of freedom and justice. But he also saw the price that would be paid for that future, the sacrifices that would be required. And he knew that he would have to be strong, to be willing to do whatever was necessary to protect his people and fulfill his destiny. As the Reverend Mother stepped back, Paul turned to face the assembled Fremen. "My friends," he said, his voice ringing out across the desert, "the time has come for us to unite, to stand together against those who would seek to destroy us. We are the Fremen, the free people of Arrakis, and we will not be defeated, not by the Harkonnen, not by the Emperor, not by anyone." The Fremen raised their voices in a great cheer, their cries echoing across the sands. And in that moment, Paul knew that he had found his true calling, his true destiny. He was the leader of the Fremen, the one who would guide them to victory against all odds. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. With Paul Muad'Dib at their head, the Fremen would be a force to be reckoned with, a power that would shake the very foundations of the Imperium. Chapter 12. As the Fremen army grew in strength and numbers, Paul knew that the time had come to strike at the heart of Harkonnen power on Arrakis. The city of Arrakeen, once the capital of House Atreides, had become a symbol of Harkonnen oppression and brutality, a place where the people lived in fear and misery. But Paul had a plan, one that would not only liberate Arrakeen, but also strike a blow against the Harkonnen that they would never forget. With the help of his Fedaykin warriors, the elite fighting force of the Fremen, Paul would infiltrate the city and take out the Harkonnen leadership in one swift, decisive strike. It was a risky gambit, one that would require all of Paul's skill and cunning to pull off, but he knew that the rewards would be worth the risk. With Arrakeen under Fremen control, they would have a base of operations from which to launch further attacks against the Harkonnen and their allies. As Paul and his warriors made their way across the desert, they were joined by a surprise ally, Princess Irulan, the daughter of the Padishah Emperor himself. Irulan had been sent to Arrakis to spy on the Fremen and report back to her father, but she had instead found herself drawn to their cause and their leader. With Irulan's inside knowledge of the Harkonnen defenses and the layout of Arrakeen, Paul was able to plan his attack with even greater precision. And when the time came, the Fremen struck with a fury that took the Harkonnen completely by surprise. In the chaos of the battle, Paul found himself face to face with the beast Rabban, the sadistic nephew of Baron Harkonnen and the ruler of Arrakeen. Rabban was a formidable opponent, a man who reveled in violence and cruelty, but Paul was more than a match for him. With a swift, sure strike of his cryst knife, Paul cut Rabban down, ending his reign of terror once and for all. And as the Harkonnen forces scattered in disarray, the Fremen swept through the city, liberating the people and claiming Arrakeen as their own. It was a moment of triumph for Paul and the Fremen, a victory that would be remembered for generations to come. But even as they celebrated their success, Paul knew that the struggle was far from over. The Harkonnen would not take this defeat lightly, and the Emperor himself would soon take notice of the growing power of the Fremen on Arrakis. Paul would need all of his strength and all of his wisdom to navigate the treacherous waters ahead, to forge alliances and make the hard choices that would determine the fate of his people and his planet. But for now, in this moment of victory, Paul allowed himself to feel a sense of hope and possibility. With Arrakeen under Fremen control, they had taken a great step forward in their fight for freedom and justice, and with the support of his warriors and his allies, Paul knew that anything was possible. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Fremen and their leader, Paul Muad'Dib, would not rest until they had brought about a new dawn for Arrakis and all of its people. Chapter 13. With Arrakeen secured and the Harkonnen forces in retreat, Paul turned his attention to consolidating his power and expanding his influence across Arrakis. He knew that the key to victory lay not just in military might, but in winning the hearts and minds of the people. To that end, Paul began to implement a series of sweeping reforms aimed at improving the lives of the common folk. He abolished the hated water tax that had kept the people of Arrakis in poverty for generations, and he instituted a system of fair and equitable water distribution that ensured that everyone had access to this most precious resource. At the same time, Paul worked to build alliances with other key players on the galactic stage. He reached out to the Spacing Guild, the powerful organization that controlled all interstellar travel, and negotiated a deal that would ensure the flow of spice from Arrakis while also protecting the interests of the Fremen. He also forged ties with the Bene Gesserit, the secretive order of women who had long manipulated the politics of the Imperium from behind the scenes. Paul knew that the Bene Gesserit had their own agenda, but he also recognized the value of their support and their knowledge. As Paul's influence grew, so too did the legend of Muad'Dib, the prophet and savior of the Fremen people. Across Arrakis, people began to whisper of the coming of a new age, a time when the Fremen would rise up and claim their rightful place as the rulers of the planet. But even as Paul basked in the adulation of his followers, he knew that danger lurked around every corner. The Emperor, fearing the growing power of the Fremen, dispatched his feared Sardaukar warriors to Arrakis with orders to crush the rebellion and restore imperial control. Paul, however, was ready for them. With the help of his Fidakan warriors and the support of the Fremen people, he met the Sardaukar head-on, in a battle that would determine the fate of Arrakis and the Imperium itself. The fighting was fierce and bloody, with heavy losses on both sides. But in the end, Paul and the Fremen emerged victorious, their superior knowledge of the desert and their unbreakable spirit proving too much for even the Emperor's most elite soldiers. With the Sardaukar defeated and the Emperor's power broken, Paul knew that the time had come to claim his rightful place as the ruler of Arrakis and the Imperium. But he also knew that the path ahead would not be easy, and that many challenges still lay before him. For even as he took the throne, Paul was haunted by visions of the future, glimpses of a coming jihad that would consume the galaxy in the name of Muad'Dib. He knew that he would have to be vigilant and wise, to steer his people and his empire through the treacherous waters ahead. But for now, in this moment of triumph, Paul could only feel a sense of awe and gratitude for all that he and the Fremen had accomplished. They had risen from the sands of Arrakis to become the most powerful force in the known universe, and they had done it through sheer grit, determination, and an unshakable faith in their cause. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. With Paul Muad'Dib at the helm, the Fremen and the Imperium would never be the same again. Chapter 14. As Paul took his place on the imperial throne, he knew that his work was only just beginning. The Imperium was a vast and complex entity, with 1,000 different factions and interests all vying for power and influence. To truly bring about lasting change, Paul would need to navigate this treacherous landscape with all the skill and cunning he possessed. One of his first acts as emperor was to dismantle the old system of feudal rule that had held sway for so long. In its place, he instituted a new order based on merit and ability, where the most capable and deserving individuals could rise to positions of power and responsibility. At the same time, Paul worked to spread the teachings of the Fremen way across the Imperium, promoting a philosophy of self-reliance, adaptability, and respect for the natural world. He knew that the key to long-term stability and prosperity lay in creating a society that could thrive in even the harshest of environments. But even as Paul worked to build a better future, he was plagued by dark visions of the coming jihad, a holy war that would consume the galaxy in blood and fire. He knew that he would have to find a way to prevent this catastrophe, or at least to mitigate its impact. To that end, Paul began to explore the depths of his own prescient abilities, delving into the mysteries of the spice and the secrets of the Bene Gesserit. He knew that the key to unlocking the future lay in understanding the past, and in mastering the hidden powers that lay within himself. As he pushed himself to the limits of his abilities, Paul began to see glimpses of a different path, a way to avoid the coming jihad, and to lead his people to a brighter tomorrow. But he also knew that this path would require great sacrifice and risk, and that he would have to be willing to make the hard choices that lay ahead. Even as he grappled with these weighty matters, Paul was forced to confront challenges and threats from all sides. Some of his own allies, including members of the Fremen leadership, began to question his rule and his vision for the future. And old enemies, such as the remnants of the Harkonnen and the Bene Gesserit, continued to plot and scheme against him. But through it all, Paul remained steadfast in his convictions and his determination to build a better world. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he had the strength and the wisdom to see it through. And so, as the Imperium entered a new era of change and transformation, Paul Muad'Dib stood at the center of it all, a beacon of hope and inspiration for all those who believed in the power of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest of challenges. The future was still uncertain, but with Paul at the helm, anything was possible. And the Fremen, the once forgotten people of the desert, now held the fate of the galaxy in their hands, ready to shape the course of history for generations to come. Chapter 15. As Paul Muad'Dib's reign entered its second decade, the Imperium had been transformed beyond recognition. Gone were the days of oppression and inequality, replaced by a new order based on justice, compassion, and the sharing of resources. The Fremen, once a marginalized and oppressed people, were now the most respected and influential force in the galaxy, admired for their wisdom, their courage, and their unbreakable spirit. But even as the Imperium prospered under Paul's rule, the specter of the coming jihad loomed ever larger on the horizon. Paul's visions of the future grew more and more vivid, showing him a galaxy consumed by war and chaos, with billions of lives lost and entire worlds laid to waste. Desperate to find a way to prevent this catastrophe, Paul turned to the one person he knew he could trust above all others, his beloved wife, Chani. Chani had been by Paul's side from the very beginning, a constant source of strength and support through all the trials and tribulations of his rise to power. Together, Paul and Chani delved deep into the mysteries of the spice and the secrets of the Bene Gesserit, searching for a way to unlock the full potential of Paul's prescient abilities. They knew that the key to saving the future lay in understanding the past, and in unraveling the complex web of cause and effect that had led them to this moment. As they worked, Paul began to see glimpses of a different path, a way to avoid the coming jihad, and to lead the Imperium to a brighter tomorrow. But he also saw the terrible price that would have to be paid to achieve this goal, and the sacrifices that he and Chani would have to make. Despite their misgivings, Paul and Chani pressed on, driven by their love for each other and their unwavering commitment to their cause. They journeyed to the furthest reaches of the Imperium, seeking out ancient knowledge and hidden truths that had been lost for generations. Along the way, they confronted challenges and dangers beyond anything they had ever faced before. They battled against powerful enemies, both old and new, who sought to thwart their efforts and preserve the status quo. And they grappled with the weight of their own destiny, knowing that the fate of the entire galaxy rested on their shoulders. But through it all, Paul and Chani remained true to themselves and to each other, drawing strength from their bond and their shared sense of purpose. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they had the power within themselves to make a difference, to shape the future, and to create a better world for all. And so, as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Paul and Chani prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, to give up everything they had fought for in order to save the Imperium from the coming darkness. They knew that their actions would echo through the ages, inspiring generations yet unborn to strive for a better tomorrow. The future was still uncertain, but with Paul and Chani leading the way, the Imperium had a chance to avoid the catastrophe that loomed on the horizon, and the Fremen, the once forgotten people of the desert, now held the key to the salvation of the entire galaxy, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for the greater good. Chapter 16. The day of reckoning had arrived, and Paul Muad'Dib stood at the center of it all. The visions that had haunted his dreams for so long were now coming to pass, as the forces of the Imperium gathered for a final apocalyptic showdown. On one side stood the armies of the Jihad, a vast and terrible horde that had swept across the galaxy like a plague, leaving nothing but destruction and despair in their wake. Led by fanatical devotees of Paul's teachings, twisted beyond all recognition, they sought to impose their will on all of humanity, no matter the cost. On the other side stood Paul and his allies, a diverse coalition of freemen, guild navigators, and former imperial forces, united by their shared desire for peace and their faith in Paul's vision of a better future. They knew that the odds were stacked against them, but they also knew that they had no choice but to stand and fight, to put an end to the jihad once and for all. As the two sides clashed on the sands of Arrakis, Paul and Chani fought side by side, their moves perfectly synchronized, their hearts beating as one. They had trained for this moment for years, honing their skills and their prescient abilities to a razor's edge, knowing that the fate of the galaxy would be decided by their actions on this day. But even as they fought, Paul could feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon him, the terrible knowledge that he alone held the key to ending the jihad and saving the Imperium. He had seen the path that lay before him, the sacrifices that he would have to make, and he knew that the time had come to face his fate. With a heavy heart, Paul turned to Chani and embraced her one last time, pouring all of his love and his gratitude into that final moment. He knew that he was asking her to carry on without him, to lead the Fremen and the Imperium into a new era of peace and prosperity, but he also knew that she was strong enough to bear that burden. As he stepped forward to confront the leader of the jihad, Paul felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, and he knew that he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. In the end, it was not Paul's prescience or his fighting skills that saved the day, but his unwavering commitment to his vision of a better future. By sacrificing himself, he was able to break the cycle of violence and hatred that had consumed the galaxy for so long, and to set the Imperium on a new path, one that would lead to a brighter tomorrow for all. As the dust settled and the armies dispersed, Chani and the Fremen took up the mantle of leadership, determined to carry on Paul's legacy and to build a new society based on the principles of justice, equality, and compassion. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they had the strength and the wisdom to see it through. And so, as the Imperium entered a new era of peace and prosperity, the legend of Paul Muad'Dib continued to grow, inspiring generations of freemen and humans alike to strive for a better world. His sacrifice had not been in vain, and his vision of a galaxy free from oppression and injustice would endure long after he was gone. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: the Fremen and the memory of their great leader would never be forgotten. They had risen from the sands of Arrakis to change the course of history, and their legacy would live on forever, a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of times. Epilogue. Years had passed since the great battle that had ended the jihad and saved the Imperium from destruction. The galaxy had entered a new era of peace and prosperity, guided by the wisdom and compassion of the Fremen and their allies. On Arrakis, the desert planet that had been the birthplace of Paul Muad'Dib and the cradle of the Fremen uprising, life had returned to a semblance of normality. The great worms still roamed the sands, and the spice still flowed from the depths of the desert. But the people of Arrakis were no longer oppressed or exploited, free to live their lives as they saw fit. At the heart of this new society stood Chani, the woman who had been Paul's beloved wife and his most trusted advisor. She had taken up the mantle of leadership after his sacrifice, guiding the Fremen and the Imperium with a steady hand and an unwavering commitment to justice and compassion. Under her rule, the Fremen had become a beacon of hope and inspiration for all of humanity, a shining example of what could be achieved when people worked together for the common good. They had shared their knowledge and their resources with the rest of the galaxy, helping to rebuild what had been lost in the long years of war and chaos. But even as she led her people to a brighter future, Chani never forgot the man who had made it all possible. Every day, she would visit the simple tomb where Paul's body had been laid to rest, a quiet place of reflection and remembrance amidst the bustling life of the Sietch. There she would sit and talk to him, sharing her hopes and her fears, her triumphs and her challenges. She knew that he was gone, But she also knew that his spirit lived on, guiding her and the Fremen people towards their destiny. And as she sat there, surrounded by the stillness of the desert and the memories of the man she had loved, Chani knew that the future was bright. The Fremen had achieved something that had once seemed impossible, and they had done it through the power of their own strength and determination. The galaxy would never forget the name of Paul Muad'Dib, the man who had sacrificed everything to save humanity from itself. But it would also never forget the Fremen, the people who had taken his vision and made it a reality, who had proven that even the most impossible dreams could come true, if only one had the courage to fight for them. And so, as the twin moons of Arrakis rose over the desert once more, Chani smiled, knowing that the legacy of the Fremen would endure for generations to come. They had risen from the sands of Dune to change the course of history, and nothing would ever be the same again. The end.